Hello and welcome to Astrofic, your weekly dose of fun, relatable astrology content where we apply astrology to fictional characters to find out why they're like that. But first, let me explain how this works and who I am. Hey, I'm Celeste, and I've been studying astrology off and on for about 5 years now, but it's always been present in my life. Within the past couple of years, I began practicing the art of reading birth charts, and this podcast is just another tool for me to apply and familiarize myself with all that I've learned. However, this podcast is intended for entertainment purposes only. I will be explaining the astrology as I go, but I'll be explaining it as I understand it, and I am by no means an expert. Making this podcast is fun for me because I get to ramble about my favorite characters and astrology combined. And while I hope you learn something, you very well may not. Either way, the more you know about astrology, the more you'll enjoy this podcast. So I do encourage all my listeners to passively take in as much knowledge as they can. For this podcast, I will be using the whole sign house system because it is just a much more basic outline of the house system and fits better with the format of a podcast where I can't show you the physical birth chart. When it comes to what birth date I use for characters, I will use canon birth dates if they exist to make it more challenging for me to work with the characterization. But before we get started, let's take a little break for our advertisements. This week, we're talking about everyone's favorite Shih Tzu assistant, Isabelle of the Nintendo game series Animal Crossing. If you don't know what Animal Crossing is, first of all, where have you been the past couple of years? It is a collector's game of sorts. There are all kinds of catchable critters you can find and cute furniture to unlock. Plus, you get to decorate your home however you want. The date I'm using for Isabelle's birthday is the date of her first appearance in the game, which was December 20th, 2012. Almost a full decade ago now. Happy early 10-year anniversary, Isabelle. As always, starting out with the big three, Isabelle is a Sagittarius sun. I think this is so funny because the characteristics the fans have given her. Like, she always has a glass of tea with an ice cube in it during her announcements in the newest game, but it looks kind of like a glass of whiskey, so she's been given the personality of like a very eager and helpful but overworked assistant who loves to party on the weekends. Also, she's in Super Smash Brothers and is a pretty good character to play, so there are a lot of Isabelle mains, and watching this little Shih Tzu beat the shit out of like Cloud from Final Fantasy or Ike from Fire Emblem is hilarious. Very Sagittarius to me. Sag is the fun-loving, truth-telling, mutable fire sign. I always associate Sag with partying and having fun and just like being authentic and speaking your truth. Especially like spring break parties, even though Sag season is in the winter. Next is Isabelle's moon sign, which is in Pisces. Another mutable sign, Isabelle is adaptable and capable of overcoming most obstacles. Another thing that makes her a good character to play in Smash, as well as the best secretary/assistant Tom Nook could ever find. A Pisces moon makes Isabelle rather emotional, as the moon is our emotions and Pisces is a water sign. Water sign moons are the most emotional of any other moon sign, which makes sense if you think about the real moon and the fact that the moon affects the tides and all that. With a Pisces moon, she's also deeply intuitive and capable of understanding what other people need before they do, which is another good mark of a great assistant or secretary. On to the last of her big three, her rising sign. Now, the rising sign is the only sign in this entire birth chart that I picked. The rest was calculated using the date of her first appearance, as I said in the beginning of the episode. However, the date of first appearance does not include the timestamp of her first appearance, so no rising sign could be calculated. All that being said, I gave her a Virgo rising. Again, another mutable sign, this time for the earth element. Isabelle is structured and organized normally, but her Pisces moon can make her a little spacey, a little messy. We need some variety. Overall, I think she has a very well-balanced chart so far, and the Virgo rising only adds to that. With her rising sign in Virgo, that means she has her first house in Virgo as well. However, other than her rising sign, Isabelle has no placements in the first house. So, because of that, we're going to skip it and the second house in Libra, which also has no placements. This puts us at the third house in Scorpio. The third house is the house of communication and local perception. It rules over your immediate environment, short distance travel, neighbors and siblings, as well as one's behaviors, habits, and thought patterns. Isabelle has two placements in this house, only one of which is a planet. So let's start with the one that's not a planet, the North Node. Isabelle's birth chart is essentially saying she needs to embody the more Scorpio energy in her life, which is wild. But considering Scorpio is Mars ruled, I think she achieves that pretty well with her introduction to the Smash Bros world. I mean, she did just travel from one Nintendo franchise to another. That's short distance travel to me. And Scorpio is a sign of transformation. When Isabelle was added to Smash, her public image shifted slightly and she was suddenly much more popular. The planet Isabelle has in her third house is Saturn, the planet of restriction, discipline, and time. I think this placement makes Isabelle sort of selective about what she says, or at least she tries to be selective. Sometimes when she's giving announcements, she goes off on a tangent, but that's more due to her Mercury than the third house in Saturn. What's interesting about her Saturn placement, though, is that Isabelle has a very small space to move around in. At least in Animal Crossing New Horizons, she does. I don't know about the other games. So perhaps Saturn's influence is over her movement in game. What's really fun about this episode is that a video game character doesn't have as many different settings and situations to pull examples from to support the birth chart that I've created. So it's basically whatever in game interactions you have, things canonically confirmed by the creators, and gameplay. So, because of that, also forgive me if this episode feels a little bare bones. That's kind of just because it is and it will be. So, we're just going to move right along to the fourth house in Sagittarius, where we'll not only get to talk about that Mercury placement, but also Isabel's Venus placement. Before we get into those delicious placements, though, let's set the scene. The fourth house is the house of family, home, ancestors, and private life. Isabelle does have a brother, Digby, whom she is known to care for very much. With the Sagittarius fourth house, Isabelle has a fiery sort of emotional relationship with her family, and she has that fan perception of being a partier on her off days, which is supported by fourth house Sagittarius because that's her personal time. And like I said, I think Sag is the party sign. We've talked about her sun in Sagittarius a bit already, but to put it into the context of the fourth house, taking care of her family is a point of pride for Isabelle, as well as taking care of herself. She's a caring little dog already, but she's especially caring towards her brother Digby and people she perceives as close friends or family like Tom Nook and the player. Very sweet of her. Okay, now on to the fun stuff, personal planets. First off, Isabelle's Sagittarius Mercury in the fourth house. Isabelle isn't the most talkative NPC in Animal Crossing, but she is known to use conversation filler sometimes. And she is a mediator, using conversations to deal with problems. If you complain about a villager to her, she remarks about how she's quite persuasive. With Mercury in the fourth house, she can probably tap into other people's feelings pretty easily and use that to drive forward her focus because her Mercury is a fire Mercury. It's action oriented. Isabelle is a mediator and a problem solver, and that's why she's the perfect assistant. She's also ruled by her Mercury since she's a Virgo rising, so this placement comes through extra for her. That's why she seems a little sinister when she talks about how persuasive she is. It's all in good fun, though. Sagittarius is never out to hurt anyone's feelings, after all, unless they deserved it. Moving on to her Venus in Sagittarius, I love this placement. I think it's so sweet. Isabelle shows her love through acts of service, obviously, and she prefers to be shown love in either the same way or through quality time, in my opinion. And as I said before with her sun sign, Isabelle prides herself on taking care of those that she loves. It's an honor in her eyes, very admirable because very few people are actually like that. And one more thing, and then we're moving on. The reason Isabelle doesn't have a stellium in Sagittarius is because the sun is not a planet, and most definitions of a stellium don't account for either the luminaries, the sun and the moon. If you subscribe to a definition that includes the sun, then you can say she has a stellium, but as a student of astrology, I'm just going to go with the majority rule for the time being. Now we're heading into the fifth house in Capricorn, where Isabelle has two placements. The fifth house is the house of creativity and childhood. It rules over short-term flings and romance, as well as leisure, creative projects, children, and all things related to childhood. fortune or luck and just the things we do because we love doing them. In Capricorn, the creativity isn't as obvious as it may be with the other signs. There's always a very diligent sense of duty to what a Capricorn fifth houser thinks of as their creative outlet. It's noble in a way. With the introduction of the island tune that Isabelle sings, I really think that for Isabelle, her creative outlet is singing. I mean, I think she loves karaoke too. I don't know if that's canon or not, but it seems kind of obvious from some promo art and videos and stuff. And she can sing any note on command. That takes a certain level of dedication. She must have musical or vocal training of some kind. I also feel like this placement can come across in her dedication to making the town or island as fun, comforting, and lively as possible. The reason she works so well with Tom Nook is because their goals are similar, if not the same, and that Tanuki is most definitely a Capricorn. So let's talk about her planets now. First up to bat is the generational planet of Pluto. Pluto is the planet of wealth, death, and rebirth. It enacts deep, long lasting change in people's lives. However, because it's a generational planet, it doesn't get as much effect on her life or her personality, or anyone's for that matter. But we can draw some general conclusions from the houses that the general planets live in. For Isabelle, this means that we can speculate Isabelle may have had some monumental changes in her childhood, but we can only speculate because not all video game characters have deep, intense lore. So let's move on to something that has a more noticeable impact on her that we can draw examples for. Isabelle also has her Mars in the Capricorn fifth house. Mars is the planet that controls one's drive, motivation, ambition, passion, and energy. Luckily for Isabelle, Mars is in exaltation in Capricorn. When a planet is in exaltation, said planet has more influence, but it doesn't have as much influence as if the planet was in domicile, which means a planet's home sign. And just for reference, Mars's home signs are Aries and Scorpio. Mars is considered to be a malefic planet, and Capricorn is ruled by the topmost malefic planet, Saturn, which explains why Mars in Capricorn is in exaltation. So, with that little astro lesson out of the way, let's move on to the actual effects and influence this placement has on Isabelle. To say that she is a hard worker would be an understatement. People with Mars and Capricorn tend to work and overwork until they're burnt out. I should know. I have a Mars in Capricorn. Capricorn is an earth sign, and earth signs are all hard workers, but the other two know when to stop or at the very least chill out a bit. Capricorn is a cardinal sign, and cardinal signs are all about action and keeping yourself constantly moving. Hence why Capricorn can easily overwork themselves. In the fifth house, these behaviors mostly affect Isabelle's creative side, and for Isabelle, her creativity is inextricably linked with her actual job as a video game character due to her fifth house being in Capricorn. I'm going to keep bringing up the fact that Isabelle is in Smash and isn't actually that bad of a character to play as because I really feel that her Capricorn Mars can be best represented through her moves in Smash. Isabelle shares most of her moves with the villager character as well, but I think it can be perceived differently when a human character like the villager is coming at you with a rocket versus when the dog in like a little green flight attendant outfit almost is coming at you with a rocket. It's very different vibes. It's very different. Capricorn Mars, man. All right. Isabelle doesn't have any placements in the sixth house, so we're going to move ahead to the seventh house of contracts, relationships, and contractual relationships. The seventh house basically rules over all of our long lasting relationships with others, and it is the first house in the birth chart to explore others, capital O, and your relationship with them, the effect you have on them, and vice versa. For Isabelle, this house is in Pisces. This is a wonderful house to have this is a wonderful sign to have the seventh house in my opinion. Isabelle has 3 placements here. If you'll remember from the beginning of the episode, she has a Pisces moon, as well as a planet and an asteroid in Pisces. So let's start by just jumping into how the moon acts in the seventh house. For Isabelle, I think this placement is a defining factor in why she makes such a good assistant / secretary. I feel that people who have the moon in the seventh house are very empathetic, and while this isn't the nicest way to put it, typically very good at manipulating the emotions of others for their benefit. Now, the benefit doesn't necessarily have to be a selfish one. It's just whatever is the perceived benefit of the individual, or in this case, Isabelle. On the flip side of this placement, Pisces moon in the seventh house also makes her susceptible to being influenced by the emotions of those around her. I feel like Pisces moons are kind of a reflective, mirroring others, you know? Let's touch on the asteroid in this house now, which is Chiron in Pisces. I've never given a more in depth explanation of Chiron as the meaning of the placement is complex, so I typically just speed through it. However, I feel like giving a more in depth explanation this week, but not as you imagine. His front legs were depicted as human, whilst his hind legs were equine. However, he was technically not a centaur as he was sired differently than other centaurs. So he was shunned by the community of centaurs, but because he was half horse, he was also shunned by communities of humans. Chiron was abandoned by his nymph mother shortly after his birth, and his foster parents were the twins Apollo and Artemis. Chiron was dubbed the wisest and justest of all centaurs, giving him an air of nobility. When he died, Zeus put him into the stars as the constellation Centaurus. Chiron was also said to be a very good astrologer, which brings us all the way back to the asteroid Chiron. As the wounded healer of the birth chart, Chiron indicates an area of one's life where they've experienced great hardship and trauma from early on, and later in life decide that they wish to help others who may be going through a similar situation. So, for Isabelle, who has it in the seventh house, she must have had a hard time forming long lasting relationships as she grew up. A situation in which many of us can relate, I think. Or maybe it's just me. I don't know. So she tries extra hard to help people mend or strengthen their relationships in life, which makes sense as she is the one you talk to when you're having an issue with a fellow villager. The last placement Isabel has in the seventh house is her Pisces Neptune. Neptune is the planet of delusion, spirituality, and imagination. Neptune is a generational planet and, as such, doesn't have as much influence on Isabel's personality and life as the personal planets do. The cool thing about this placement, though, is that Pisces is ruled by Neptune in modern astrology. So, this is a rather beneficial placement. People with a Pisces Neptune are often very creative and imaginative. They can also get lost in their daydreams. In the seventh house, Isabel may be overly optimistic about where she stands with people, or that optimism is what caused her to acquire her Chiron wound in the first place. There's really no telling, as, again, she's a video game NPC. The next house is the eighth house in Aries. The eighth house is a very complex house in some ways as it rules over the themes of shared and veiled resources. So that's like shared money, inheritance, investments, as well as the occult, sex, death, rebirth, and transformation. If you couldn't tell by these themes, the eighth house is ruled by the planet Pluto. So let's move on to what planet is in this house. Isabel has the generational planet Uranus in the Aries 8th house. Uranus is, like Pluto, a planet that rules over change. However, the type of change Uranus rules over is more sudden and abrupt. Uranus is also the planet of rebellion and originality. In Aries, these changes can come rather abruptly for Isabel. And in the 8th house, it's likely that any shared resources Isabel has can be abruptly taken from her. Or she could even be the one to give her resources away in excess just because of her generosity. That's more in line with her personality and her birth chart. As Aries is the first sign of the zodiac, there isn't really any correlation between these things, between it and things like the occult and death, because technically Aries is the product of rebirth. It's the first sign in the cycle. Any rebellion that Isabel showcases is probably fierce and a little unexpected, like her smash career. Okay, we are skipping over to the 10th house now, as it is the last house that Isabel has any planets in. Her 10th house is in Gemini, and the 10th house rules over one's public perception. That is, it rules over how others see you and your social status in the world, as well as your legacy and stuff like that. Isabel has two placements here, so we'll start with the less influential of the two placements, her Lilith sign. Lilith in astrology is the darkest point in the sky at the time you were born. It's typically somewhere between the two lunar nodes, which could be literally anywhere in the sky. And while Lilith has an extensive history in Abrahamic mythos, there is a ton of conflicting information as well as misinformation. And I don't have enough peer backed research to have a definitive stance and understanding of her mythos. So if you want to know more about her and this sign, I encourage you to do your own independent research. In astrology, the sign of Lilith represents one's quote unquote darkest side, the side of oneself that you feel shame for having, also known as your shadow side. For Isabel, it is in Gemini. The shadow side of Gemini is one of extensive gossip and two-facedness. In the 10th house, she may use shadow aspects to get ahead in her career and society. And I mean,
Isabelle is kind of a chatterbox sometimes. People always think Gemini is an airheaded sign, which isn't technically wrong, but their perceived airheadedness is often used as a tool for their benefit. This behavior is probably exacerbated by her Virgo rising, which shares the same ruling planet as Gemini, Mercury. I like to describe the Lilith signs as being what you stereotypically associate with the zodiac signs. So everything bad you hear about Gemini may not be reflected in somebody with a Gemini sun, but may be reflected in somebody with a Gemini Lilith. Lastly, we have Isabelle's Jupiter in Gemini. The unfortunate thing about this placement is that Jupiter is in detriment when it's in Gemini. This means that the planet of luck is not so lucky for Isabelle. When a planet is in detriment, their effect is weakened or may even have the opposite effect. More commonly, though, the planet's gifts and energies are just misused. For Isabelle, it's honestly hard to tell. Like, I wouldn't say that she's lucky in social situations and mean it. Because, I mean, in New Horizons, she's basically stuck behind a counter except for holidays when she's stuck in the plaza. She's usually someone the villagers go to when they need help, but I don't know if she's the first one villagers go to for anything. If villagers need assistance, often they ask the player for help first. If they want to hang out and have fun, again, the players usually ask first. Isabelle has an important job and is really respected, but not by everyone all the time. You can go to her when you need something important, but no one needs something important done all the time, only occasionally. What a way to end an episode, I guess. Thanks for listening. I'm sorry it has taken probably twice as long for me to get this episode out than others. Caught a little cold last week and I couldn't record, and that's what I needed to do for this episode was record. So it's really just stalled production. But I'm feeling much better now. I can talk and breathe through my nose, so that's great. So yeah, that's all I have for Isabelle Animal Crossing. Please leave a rating and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts if you enjoyed this episode, and don't forget to share it with friends and fan groups.
If you want to find me on socials, I've put all my links in a handy dandy link tree in the show notes. That's linktr.ee/celestialbinch, BINCH. You can find all my socials, ways to tip me if you want, and all the other ways to listen to Astrofic there. You'll also find my Patreon there, where you can provide direct feedback about Astrofic as well as receive monthly collective readings. My name is Celeste, and you've been listening to Astrofic. Tune in next time to find out why our favorite characters are like that. Bye!